Let's move into sort of the consumer side and the Delta variant and a lot of the news on the vaccine front. There's been a lot of information here.
We can start looking at consumer sentiment. So consumer sentiment took a pretty big hit last month. This is the University of Michigan consumer sentiment fell to 70. You can see the big drop off there towards the right. That's the second largest month over month decline. Obviously, the largest was during the pandemic when consumer sentiment evaporated very quickly. There's no doubt that this is tied to the Delta variant and increased lockdown stringency, vaccine mandates coming back online. There's no doubt that's what's causing that. So consumer sentiment very volatile here, getting crushed recently with all the Delta news.
And what does that sort of translate to in terms of market outcomes or behavior?
Yeah, consumer sentiment is not a great predictor of future equity market outcomes. It's actually not even a great predictor of consumer spending decisions. What you find is consumer spending is actually in the US at least, is a remarkably stable data point. We know how to spend and we know how to do it basically every month. And consumer sentiment is far more volatile. So you have to take it with a grain of salt and see, is it actually changing behavior in a meaningful way? And no real evidence of that. I mean, retail sales were a little worse than expected, but spending on services was better than expected. So that doesn't really mesh with a big drop in sentiment due to the Delta variant. If that were the case, then I would spend less on services and maybe more on goods because I'm going to stay home and buy stuff.
Right.
So you take it with a grain of salt, and really try to focus on how our consumers actually behaving.
Right. And let's sort of follow on to your point. Let's look at some of the high frequency data and look at, to your point, there was some fall off in some of this data.
Right. Yeah. These high frequency data points. We've been looking at this chart since lockdown in 2020. And the dark blue line, open tables, seated diners year over year. So you can see with the emergence of the Delta variant and increased lockdown stringency, that's really falling off, but still at very elevated levels. Nothing like the hit we saw last fall or last winter. So that's sort of stabilizing, falling off maybe a little bit. And then TSA checkpoint traveler throughput, so a measure of how many people are getting on planes, that definitely falling off. And a lot of this once again might not necessarily be consumer sentiment driven, but a lot of events that originally were scheduled and require travel are being canceled or postponed due to an abundance of caution.
Right.
Things like galas and conferences and things like that are sort of moving remote last second. So we think that's a big reason why you're seeing checkpoint traveler throughput fall off. And then also, because the reaction function of many countries is based on case counts, you're seeing travel restrictions being re-implemented. So, the Eurozone re-implementing travel restrictions on the US, the UK opening up their economy and lifting all restrictions domestically, but we're placing a travel restriction on going into the UK. So there's that element too.
Yeah. And anecdotally, in speaking to a couple of restaurant owners of some chains, they're limiting capacity not because of COVID, just because they can't find workers. So they're only operating still at 50% for in-room dining. They're still doing a great takeout business, but it's the actual in-room dining that's really difficult for them to get capacity because they can't find workers. Let's take a look at some of the COVID data here. This is a really interesting chart based on the study out of Israel.
Yeah. Interesting, a bit difficult to interpret. So we're going to go slowly through it. But basically, this is a study. It was a sort of a preprint, if you will. So this study has not been verified yet. It has not been peer reviewed, but it was interesting enough that and potentially has big enough market ramifications and outlook ramifications that we thought this was definitely important to share. So this study, it's the first large scale study analyzing the strength and duration of immunity from infections versus vaccinations. And this came out of Israel, so the vaccination data is all based on the Pfizer vaccine. And how you would interpret this data is you take a starting point as you take somebody who had a COVID infection, what is their risk of reinfection, versus someone who was vaccinated, what is their risk of a breakthrough infection, all due to the Delta variant. And this is comparing the vaccinated individuals versus the previously infected individuals. So how you would interpret this chart, what the study says, is that those that are vaccinated are actually 13.1 times more likely or at a greater risk of getting a breakthrough infection compared to somebody who was previously infected getting a reinfection. So this suggests this is the first data we've seen that is, once again, hasn't been verified yet, but seems very compelling, that suggests that natural immunity actually may have better qualities at protecting against future infection, symptomatic infection, hospitalization than the vaccines.
Mm-hmm. So it's as least as good, but this would suggest it's perhaps better by a decent margin here.
Right. So many other caveats to throw around this. We certainly are not saying that getting COVID is better than a vaccine. The great thing about vaccines is you don't need to get COVID, right? So we're not saying that at all. But when you think about the implications of this, early on in the pandemic, and certainly before the vaccine started to come out, there was discussion about herd immunity. And now with the Delta variant, that discussion has really fallen by the wayside, because the consensus, certainly before this study, was that you can't trust natural immunity. Everybody's immune response is different. Some people produce more antibodies than others. And this data was more anecdotal, and we never really had something large scale enough to verify. If these results are verified, that would flip that narrative. That maybe herd immunity is back on the table as an idea. And if you think herd immunity is back on the table as an idea, then the silver lining here is every COVID case, as long as, it's unfortunate, but as long as you can make through that and your body can fight that, that's one less future case. Just as we look as every fully vaccinated individual is potentially one less person that can get COVID in the future. So we would look at those sort of on par with one another.
It really all just supports that we're sort of moving past this, the COVID experience, and we should be sort of on the way, out of here. So we don't have to think about the reaction function of lockdowns, the reaction function of closing things down. Like, we should be moving to a better place.
Right. Yeah. Those are the implications. And it's especially right now with the resurgence of the Delta variant and the consensus being we're just going to have to live with this forever and be on a string of vaccinations and booster shots, and it becomes endemic. This is particularly good news at this time, right?
Right.
And
I
so
think when you to your point, think about, or just tell the viewers a little bit about what happened or what's happening in India.
Right. So this is something we discussed in a prior video. So India obviously was unfortunately absolutely crushed by the Delta variant. It case counts far higher than anything they saw in any prior wave, because their vaccination rates are so low, and they just didn't have an opportunity, or they're just not set up to socially distance and safely like we are in the US. And so Delta just ran through India. But what was really interesting was that mobility was actually increasing at the same time that case counts were falling. And it was not due to high vaccination rates. So, we're saying, too early to come out and say this, we don't know, but this is very interesting to us, because if this suggests the Delta variant is so transmissible that it can rip through an entire country in a short period of time, and those that recovered actually have immunity, then that could be a silver lining. It could be a silver lining, and it could suggest herd immunity is back on the table, and fewer COVID cases in the future. So, and then it brings back on the table, like we're saying, this chart here about COVID immunity. So this is something that people haven't been looking at for a long time. We've just been looking at vaccination rates to measure, are we making progress against the virus? But if natural immunity, is strong and lasting, as the unverified study results suggest, then you could look at something like this chart, which measures the percentage of the population that is 2 weeks out from their second dose of a 2-dose vaccine or had a single-dose vaccine, and include cases that have recovered. And you count all of that as immunity, all in the same vein. And you see US is second from the left there, estimates somewhere around 80% immunity. We're still going to have localized breakouts, still going to have hospital capacity issues in different areas because there's still most likely some rural areas of the country that never really had a wave and have low vaccination rates. But if we can look at it on this type of a chart, you say, actually, there is light at the end of the tunnel here. There is a silver lining. Herd immunity could be a thing. And, if this is all true, then it'll start showing up in the case counts.
Right.
Right. We'll see falling cases or stabilizing cases, and we'll see lower hospitalizations and deaths. And that would be a great thing.